My name is Jess Dixon. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology, Faculty of Human Kinetics at the University of Windsor. A number of years ago, I was involved in a collaborative project with other faculty in the Department of Kinesiology that was funded through Sport Canada to investigate the organizational cultures of 10 national sport governing bodies and how the cultures of these organizations impacted the sport participation trends going on within each of those organizations. I was not the lead on the project, so it wasn't necessarily my question to come up with, but I believe it was, there had been a lot of other research done in other fields, and even within sport management, which is the area that I have expertise in, that had explored organizational culture. But none had looked at the relationship between culture and sport participation. So the underlying question was, what is the impact of organizational culture on sport participation? There were multiple different elements to this project. We started out with a broad survey of individuals, but the qualitative element really helped to dig beneath the surface of the results that we got in some of these quantitative responses. As you can imagine, organizational culture is something very difficult to quantify and measure. It's something that has to be experienced. So the qualitative element allowed us to dig beneath some of the surface information that we got in these surveys, to actually go in and visit with these organizations, speak to the people who are responsible for creating that culture and living it out every day. So it really helped, get us the information and the richness of data that we needed to really understand what was going on there. It was part of a much larger, it was a 3-year investigation that was part of a much larger mixed methods investigation. There were a number of ethical issues at play in this study. A couple of things come to mind. There are dozens of different national sport governing bodies. We were going to be identifying each of these. We were using a purposive sampling technique, and we were going to be identifying in our results who some of the NSOs were. When it came to some of the semi-structured interviews that we were doing, well, we wanted to be able to identify which NSO they were from, because that helped to, provide the context in which the information was being derived. We need to protect the identities of some of these people. Some of them would have been very well known to the general public, so we needed to protect the integrity of those individuals. As well, we were doing some site visits, so there are some areas that are generally off limits to the general public. So we had to navigate some of those issues even before going on site to conduct those interviews and do some of those site visits. Started with, getting ethical approval through the University of Windsor Research Ethics Board, sharing, the documentation with the members of the NSOs. With each NSO, we had sort of a point person that was responsible for sort of overseeing a sport participation initiative within that organization. They helped kind of facilitate the meetings that we had. From there, they pass it on to other people within their organization to seek approval. And then when we actually got on site, it was providing, the individuals that we, were wanting to interview with consent forms and providing them with copies of all the transcripts afterwards to ensure that, we were attributing, the comments to them accurately, giving them the chance to remove anything that, they didn't feel was appropriate. And there were certain times and certain things that we saw and heard that, we were asked not to share. So we had to be a little bit more vague in, providing some of that information when we were publishing and presenting it at conferences. Regarding the qualitative techniques and why we use them for this particular study, well, I mentioned earlier that we started with 10 NSOs. So we used a purposive sampling to identify the 10 NSOs, and then basically each of those 10 were individual case studies. They were selected on the basis of their size and their history and tradition, based on their approach, I suppose, to sport participation versus sport performance and elite performance. We also looked at the extent of commercial viability of these organizations, so how much sponsorship support they were getting from partners and so forth. So we tried to have sort of a broad array. We also tried to be encompassing of both summer and winter, sports, so that we can kind of get the full gamut there. Once we got to the point of identifying who the 10 were and sought permission and received permission to begin the investigation, the first thing we did is a survey. So we used an instrument that measures or attempts to measure organizational culture, and we had a third-party organization that helped to facilitate that process. Working with our contacts at each of the organizations, we identified a list of people. So we were interested in paid staff, volunteers, and sport participants. So we had 3 different groups that we were looking at and asked them to complete a survey that tried to unearth, some aspects of the culture of those organizations. Once we had that data, the next step was to set up site visits. And so we did, a bit of an ethnographic kind of approach where we went in and spent about 2 days in each organization and just sort of observed what was going on. We got tours of their facilities, met a number of different people within the organizations. All throughout that time, we were taking vast notes about what we saw, and we debriefed. There was 2 researchers at each one. There was a faculty member who was involved in the project, and then a graduate assistant that came along to. The graduate assistants went to a couple of different ones. And basically each night we would then debrief on what we saw and made additional notes and sort of cross-reference what we had to make sure we were on the same page and everything. And then in the second day we went back and did interviews with each of the individuals that we had sort of targeted at the different levels of the organization. And within those interviews, they're semi-structured. We wanted some consistency across all the different NSOs so we could compare and contrast the answers and whatnot. And again, it was asking questions about what we read about in the results of the survey, what we saw on our tour. Another element that I haven't mentioned yet is we did prior to going, we did a real comprehensive content analysis of the websites. So how they were communicating their culture to their participants, people who might be interested in the sport, and all their other stakeholder groups. So we took all that information back and then tried to make sense of it.